Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Speak Smart podcast. We're diving into something today that I think a lot of people struggle with, the fear of speaking English. Like when your heart starts racing, your palms get all sweaty, and all those vocabulary words you thought you would memorize just disappear. But don't worry, it's totally normal to feel this way. And the good news is that this fear, even though it's common, is absolutely something you can overcome.
Yeah, that's right. We're going to be taking a look at a podcast episode that goes deep into this fear, and we'll pull out some really useful tips and tricks so that you, our awesome listener, can feel more confident speaking English.
Sounds good. So let's just get right to it. What are some of the common things that people are afraid of when it comes to speaking English?
Well, just think about it for a second. You're using a language that isn't your native language. It makes sense to be a little worried about making mistakes. Maybe messing up the grammar or how you pronounce things. But then there's also that extra layer of fear, the fear that people are going to judge you or that they won't understand you at all.
It's almost like you're on a stage with a big spotlight shining right on you. Except that stage could be anywhere, like ordering coffee or even giving a presentation at work. That pressure can feel really intense.
Absolutely. And that's exactly why it's super important to understand that these fears often come from negative self-talk and limiting beliefs. We might tell ourselves things like, I'm just not good at languages, or I'll never be able to sound like a native speaker. And those thoughts, they can really hold us back from actually learning the language.
It's almost like we're putting up these mental roadblocks before we even get started. So how do we break free from those negative thoughts?
One of the best things you can do is to challenge those limiting beliefs. So instead of getting stuck on what you can't do, try shifting your focus to what you can do.
You mean like celebrating those little wins? Like using a new phrase in a conversation or finally understanding a tricky grammar rule?
Exactly. It's super important to see and acknowledge your progress, even if it feels small. This helps build confidence. Instead of trying to be perfect, which is impossible, by the way, focus on getting better little by little, step by step.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like if you're training for a marathon. You wouldn't expect to just go out and run 26 miles on your first day. You'd start with shorter distances, build up your endurance, and celebrate hitting each milestone along the way.
Exactly. And just like training for a marathon, having people who support you can make a world of difference. The podcast episode we're looking at today actually had a great tip. Practice speaking English with people you trust. This could be a friend, a family member, or even someone else who's learning English too.
It's like having a safe space to try things out. You can make mistakes and get feedback without feeling judged. I remember when I was learning Spanish, I used to practice with my grandmother. She spoke both Spanish and English, and she was so patient and encouraging. It really helped me feel more confident.
That's such a great example. When you create that comfortable, supportive environment, it lets you focus on the fun of learning and communicating, instead of being afraid of making mistakes.
So we're starting small, building our confidence and finding people who support us. What are some other practical things we can do to get over that initial fear of speaking?
This podcast had some amazing advice on that. One of the simplest but most effective things you can do is the mirroring technique. It might sound a little weird, but give it a try. Practice speaking English in front of a mirror.
Mirroring. Interesting. How does that help?
Think about it. When we talk, we're not only using words, our facial expressions and how we move our bodies are also communicating things. When you practice in front of a mirror, you start to notice these nonverbal cues, and you become more aware of how other people might be seeing you.
So it's almost like you're your own audience.
Exactly. You can work on things like making eye contact, smiling, using hand gestures, all those little things that help you communicate confidently. And here's another tip. Try recording yourself speaking English and then listening back to it.
I've heard about that technique, but to be honest, I've always been too self-conscious to try it. What's the benefit of listening to yourself speak?
It can really help you see things you might not have noticed before. You might pick up on patterns in your pronunciation or grammar that you didn't realize were there. It also helps you get used to hearing your own voice speaking English, which can be a big hurdle for some people.
It's like getting to know yourself as an English speaker, and that can definitely boost your confidence. You can try that. And speaking of technology, what about those language learning apps? Are those helpful for getting over the fear of speaking?
They definitely can be. They're great tools, especially if you like things to be a bit more organized. A lot of apps have interactive exercises where you actually practice speaking, and you get personalized feedback on how you're pronouncing things and how fluent you sound.
It's like having a language tutor right there in your pocket. I like how some apps turn learning into games. It makes it feel less like studying and more like having fun.
Exactly. And the best part is you can tailor them to your own goals and level. You can focus on the things you're having trouble with, like vocabulary, grammar, or pronunciation.
So we've got mirroring, recording ourselves, and trying out language learning apps. All great ways to build confidence. But what about those real-life situations that can make us anxious? Like ordering food at a restaurant or asking for directions in a new city. How do we handle those?
Yeah, that's where it really matters, right? Putting all this into practice in the real world. And the podcast we're talking about had a whole section on exactly that. Real-life situations and how to handle them with confidence.
Perfect. Let's say you're at a restaurant, menu in hand, but you're feeling a little nervous about ordering. What's a good way to approach that?
Okay, so picture this. The waiter comes up and asks, "Can I take your order?" And you just take a breath, make eye contact, and say, "Yes, I'd like the grilled salmon with the side of asparagus, please."
See? That wasn't so hard. But what if you have a question about something on the menu? Or what if you need to ask for something special?
That's a really good point. The podcast episode gave some useful phrases you can use, like you could say, "Could you tell me more about this dish?" Or, "Is it possible to substitute the fries for a salad?" Don't be afraid to ask for clarification or to let them know what you need.
It's all about feeling comfortable communicating, even if you're not completely fluent. And speaking of feeling empowered, what about those times when you need to ask for directions? I know that's always a bit of a struggle for me, even in my own language.
You're definitely not alone there. Getting lost, whether it's in a new city or just trying to find a place, can be a bit overwhelming. The podcast recommended a pretty simple approach. So let's say you're trying to find the train station. You could go up to someone and say, "Excuse me, I'm trying to get to the train station. Could you point me in the right direction?"
It sounds so easy, but so many people hesitate to ask for help. Like we're afraid to seem lost or like we don't know what we're doing.
I get that feeling, but honestly, most people are happy to help. And if you don't quite understand their directions the first time, don't be shy about asking them to repeat. Something like, "Could you repeat that, please?" Or, "I'm sorry, I didn't catch that. Could you say it again?" Can really help.
Those are great tips. And sometimes all you need is a visual. You could even ask, "Would you mind drawing a quick map for me?" Most people are more than willing to do that.
Exactly. The important thing to remember is that communication goes both ways. Don't be afraid to ask questions, clarify things, and use whatever tools you need to make sure you understand.
So we've talked about ordering food and finding your way around, but what about those more casual interactions, like starting a conversation with someone new? Small talk can be tricky, even in our native language.
You're so right. That fear of awkward silences, saying the wrong thing, or just not knowing how to keep the conversation going, can be really intimidating. But here's the thing. Small talk doesn't have to be scary.
Okay, I'm all ears.
Yeah.
How do we make small talk less, well, small and awkward? Especially when we're speaking English.
The podcast really stressed finding common ground. Start with simple topics like the weather, what's happening in the news, or things you both enjoy.
Like, beautiful day, isn't it? Or, have you seen the new exhibit at the museum?
Exactly. Those are great ways to start a conversation. And here's another tip. Be a good listener.
Oh, I'm always up for that. But what does being a good listener have to do with speaking confidently?
Well, when you really listen to someone, nodding, making eye contact, asking questions, you're showing that you're genuinely interested in what they have to say. This takes the pressure off of you to be witty or entertaining all the time. And it helps the conversation flow naturally.
It's like that saying, people might forget what you said, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. Being a good listener makes people feel like they're being heard.
That's it. And that can make a big difference in connecting with people and feeling more confident.
So we've learned some practical phrases for common situations, and we've explored how powerful active listening can be. But what about those times when the fear comes back, even when we feel prepared? How do we deal with that feeling of panic?
That's a great question, and it's important to remember that everyone feels self-doubt or anxiety sometimes, even people who are fluent in English. The key is to develop ways to manage those feelings. The podcast had some really good suggestions for this. One technique they talked about was role-playing.
Role-playing, like we used to do in drama class.
You got it. Find a language partner, a friend, or someone in your family, and practice different situations. You could take turns being a customer and a waiter, a tourist asking for directions, or two people meeting at a party.
It sounds like a fun way to practice those real-life conversations in a safe environment. You can mess up, laugh about it, and learn from each other.
Exactly. And if you'd rather practice on your own, those language learning apps we talked about can be a big help. Many of them have exercises where you can talk with virtual characters or record yourself and get feedback on your pronunciation and fluency.
It's amazing how much technology can help with language learning. It's like having a personal coach and a practice partner right there in your pocket. But what about people who might feel a little shy about practicing with an app or even with a friend? Are there other ways to get more comfortable with hearing ourselves speak English?
Absolutely. The podcast mentioned a technique called shadowing, which basically means imitating native speakers. You listen to recordings like podcasts, audiobooks, or even TV shows, and try to repeat what you hear, matching their pronunciation, intonation, and rhythm as closely as you can.
Shadowing. Interesting. I've never heard of that one before. It sounds like a fun way to immerse yourself in the language and pick up on all those subtle things that make native speakers sound so natural.
It is. And don't worry about sounding perfect. The goal is just to get comfortable with the sounds and rhythms of English and train your ear to pick up on those little details of pronunciation.
It's like a vocal workout for your English. I can definitely see how that would help you build confidence and fluency. And what about reading out loud? Is that a good way to practice?
For sure. Pick a book, an article, or even just a blog post in English that you find interesting and read it out loud, focusing on your pronunciation, how your voice goes up and down, and putting some expression into it.
I used to do that with poetry when I was younger. It really helped me connect with the language and feel the rhythm and flow.
Exactly. And you can even record yourself reading aloud and listen back to it later. Just like we talked about with practicing speaking, it's a great way to figure out where you might want to improve and see how much progress you're making.
These are all fantastic ways to build our skills and get more comfortable speaking English. But we all know that confidence isn't just about skills. It's also about how we think, right?
You hit the nail on the head. The podcast episode we're looking at today actually spent a good chunk of time talking about the importance of having a positive mindset when you're learning a language. Let's dive into that now.
Yeah, we've talked about so many practical tips and tricks to speak English more confidently. But you're right, mindset is huge. It's like you can have all the tools, but if you don't believe in yourself, it's going to be a struggle.
Exactly. It really comes down to how we talk to ourselves. If we're always thinking negative things like I'm not good enough or I'll never be fluent or people are going to judge me, it's going to be hard to feel confident. The podcast really emphasized how important it is to notice that negative self-talk and then actually replace it with positive affirmations.
So instead of saying something like I'm terrible at pronunciation, I could say I'm learning and getting better every day.
You got it. It's kind of like you're rewiring your brain to focus on the progress you're making and what's possible instead of getting stuck on fear and limitations. These positive affirmations might feel a little strange at first, but if you keep doing it, they can actually change how you see yourself and what you're capable of.
I like that it's like planting little seeds of confidence that will grow into something much bigger.
And here's another powerful tool they talked about: visualization. Just close your eyes for a minute and imagine yourself speaking English fluently and confidently. See yourself in a specific situation like giving a presentation at work or talking with friends at a party.
Wow, I can actually feel a difference. Just picturing myself speaking English easily and feeling confident already makes me less nervous.
The more you practice visualizing yourself as a confident English speaker, the more your brain starts to believe it's actually possible. And as that belief grows, so does your confidence.
It's like training your brain to expect success instead of failure.
Exactly. And speaking of success, remember we talked about celebrating those small wins? The podcast really highlighted how important it is to recognize your progress, no matter how small it might seem. Did you learn a new phrase this week? Did you have a conversation without feeling totally overwhelmed by anxiety? Those are all things to celebrate.
It's true. It's so easy to focus on what we haven't accomplished yet and forget to appreciate how far we've come.
I agree. They had a really practical tip in the podcast. Keep a language learning journal. Write down new words you learned, conversations that went well, even compliments people give you on your English. It's like a physical reminder of how much you're improving.
Right.
And it can be really motivating, especially when you're feeling a bit discouraged.
I love that idea. It's like you're creating this visual record of your whole journey and all those little milestones you've reached along the way.
And remember, learning a language takes time. It's a marathon, not a sprint. There will be days when you feel frustrated, stuck, or even want to give up. That's completely normal. The important thing is to be kind to yourself, acknowledge those feelings, and then just keep going.
It's all about embracing the ups and downs of the journey, knowing that every step forward, even a tiny one, is taking you in the right direction.
Exactly. And if you start having those negative thoughts again, remember mindfulness. Take a few deep breaths, focus on right now, and try to quiet your mind. Those moments of quiet can help you get some perspective and manage your anxiety.
Those are great tips for staying motivated and dealing with those times when we doubt ourselves. But what about the bigger picture? How do we actually make English a part of our lives in a way that feels good and not like a chore?
The podcast had some really cool ideas about how to weave English into your daily routine in a way that feels natural and fun. One of the easiest things you can do is just surround yourself with the language as much as possible.
You mean like listening to English music, watching movies and TV shows in English, or reading English books?
Exactly. Even little changes can make a difference, like switching your phone's language to English or following English-speaking accounts on social media. It's all about creating more opportunities to hear and practice the language.
It's like making your own little English-speaking world, even if you don't live in an English-speaking country.
Exactly. And they also talked about setting SMART goals. That means specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. So instead of having a vague goal like, I want to be fluent, try setting a more specific goal like, I want to learn 10 new words every week, or I want to watch one English movie without subtitles twice a month.
Those smaller, more concrete goals seem much less overwhelming and probably more motivating too. It's like breaking down a big project into smaller, more manageable steps.
Right. And don't forget to reward yourself for all your hard work, whether it's a little treat, doing something you enjoy, or just taking a moment to acknowledge your effort. Those rewards help you stick with good habits and keep you going.
It's about enjoying the journey, not just reaching the destination. And what about people who might learn better in a more structured environment? Did the podcast have any suggestions for that?
They did. They talked about how valuable formal classes or online courses can be, especially for people who do well with a more organized learning setting. Classes can give you expert guidance, access to resources, and a chance to connect with other learners.
It's like having a built-in support group and someone to keep you accountable. And online courses are great for people who don't have the time or resources for traditional classes.
Absolutely. And finally, they shared some truly inspiring stories of people from all over the world who have overcome their fear of speaking English. I think these stories really show that you're not alone in this.
Always love hearing those real-life experiences. It's so encouraging to know that people from all walks of life with different backgrounds and ways of learning have been able to reach their goals.
There was Maria from Brazil, who used to be terrified of speaking English, but she found her voice through a local conversation club. And Ahmed from Egypt, who was self-conscious about his accent, but he worked really hard on his pronunciation and built up his confidence. And Yuki from Japan, who dreamed of working in another country, and she made it happen through consistent effort and immersion.
Those stories are so inspiring. They show that no matter where you're starting from, if you have the right mindset, strategies, and support, you can definitely become fluent and confident.
I couldn't agree more. It's all about taking that first step, believing in yourself, and embracing the journey.
Wow, this has been such an amazing deep dive. I feel so motivated and energized to keep working on my own language learning journey.
Me too. It's been awesome exploring all these strategies and insights with you.
Thank you so much for joining me on this episode of Speak Smart. To everyone listening out there, we believe in you. Keep practicing, stay positive, and never stop learning.
And remember, the world is waiting to hear your voice.
And that's a wrap of this episode of Speak Smart. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.